Sometimes the most successful men are the loneliest, and Barrett Cole knew that truth better than most. He'd built a cattle empire from nothing, but family was something money couldn't buy back once it was lost. When word came that he'd inherited an estate from a relative he'd never heard of, Barrett almost threw the papers in the fire. But something about that name kept pulling at him like an old wound. Days later, he found himself standing before a mansion that locals said was cursed. The whole family had vanished decades ago, leaving behind only whispers and fear. But in the cellar vault, Barrett discovered letters and ledgers that revealed a terrible family secret. His ancestors had built their fortune on betrayal, disowning their own kin for reasons that would change everything he believed about his legacy. What would you do if the truth could destroy everything you'd worked for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by young Tommy Fletcher, who rode the 20 miles from town twice a week with the mail. Barrett Cole had been standing in the corral, watching his prize bull eye the fence line with that particular look that meant trouble was brewing, when Tommy's dust cloud appeared on the horizon. "Morning, Mr. Cole," Tommy had called, swinging down from his mare with the easy grace of youth. "Got something official looking for you here." Barrett had accepted the yellow envelope with calloused hands that had built an empire from nothing but grit and determination. The Cole Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, and every inch of it bore the mark of his labor. At 53, Barrett commanded respect from every cattleman between Billings and Great Falls. His word was his bond, his handshake worth more than most men's contracts. But success, he'd learned, was a cold companion on winter nights. The telegram's contents had puzzled him initially. Legal language about an inheritance from one Ezra Cole of Virginia, a name that stirred something deep in his memory, like sediment disturbed in a still pond. Barrett had no known relatives. His father, Jacob Cole, had died when Barrett was barely 20, taking with him any stories about family beyond their small Montana homestead. His mother had passed 2 years later, and with her went the last threads connecting him to anything resembling kinship. Yet here was this Ezra Cole, dead now according to the telegram, leaving him property in Virginia. The coincidence of the shared surname might have been dismissed, except for one detail that haunted Barrett through sleepless nights. Somewhere in the dusty corners of his childhood memories, he could almost hear his father's voice mentioning that name. Miguel Santos, his ranch foreman and the closest thing to family Barrett had known in decades, had found him that evening sitting on the porch with the telegram in his hands and a bottle of whiskey barely touched beside him. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," Miguel had said, settling into the chair beside Barrett with a grunt. At 65, Miguel's bones carried the weight of a lifetime spent in the saddle, but his dark eyes remained sharp as a hawk's. "Maybe I have," Barrett had replied, handing over the telegram. Miguel read slowly, his weathered finger following each line. "Ezra Cole," Miguel had mused. "That name means something to you." It wasn't a question. Miguel had worked the ranch for 15 years, and in that time he'd become expert at reading Barrett's moods. The two men had developed an easy partnership built on mutual respect and shared solitude. Miguel had his own ghosts, a family lost to consumption back in Mexico, a young man's dreams buried with them, and understood that some silences were meant to be honored. "My father mentioned that name once," Barrett had said finally. "I was maybe 12, helping him mend fence near the creek. He was in one of his rare talking moods, reminiscing about his own father, my grandfather. Said something about Ezra being the smart one, the one who got out before." Barrett had paused, trying to capture the exact words across 4 decades. "Before the trouble found them." What kind of trouble? He never said. But the way he spoke about it. Barrett had taken a small sip of whiskey, feeling its burn chase away the chill of memory, like it was something shameful, something that drove good men apart. Miguel had studied the telegram again, Says here the property's in Albemarle County, Virginia. That's a long way from Montana. Too far, Barrett had agreed, but even as he said it, he knew he was lying to himself. The pull he felt toward that distant inheritance was stronger than logic or convenience. Now, 3 days later, Barrett stood in his bedroom before an open trunk, deciding what a man takes when he ventures toward his own past. The room was sparse, functional: a bed, a wardrobe, a small writing desk, where he kept the ranch's financial records. On the desk sat a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame, the only photograph he owned. The image was faded and cracked, taken when he was perhaps 8 years old. He stood between his parents, his father's hand heavy on his shoulder, his mother's face serene despite the hardships Barrett now knew she'd endured. But it was the background of the photograph that had caught his attention since receiving the telegram. Behind his family, barely visible in the shadows of their small cabin, stood another figure, a man Barrett had never noticed before in all his years of looking at this picture. The stranger's face was partially obscured, but his bearing suggested both authority and sorrow. Barrett had studied that shadowy figure with a magnifying glass, searching for clues, but the old photograph revealed nothing more than questions. "You sure about this trip?" Miguel's voice came from the doorway. Barrett looked up to find his foreman watching him with concern. "No," Barrett admitted, "but I'm going anyway." Miguel stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with quiet wisdom. A man's got a right to know where he comes from, but sometimes the knowing costs more than the ignorance. Barrett folded a clean shirt and placed it in the trunk. "My father carried secrets that ate at him. I watched it happen, saw how the not-telling wore him down year by year. I won't live like that. And if what you find is something you'd rather not know?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Barrett considered it seriously, as he considered all of Miguel's counsel. The older man had earned his wisdom through loss and hard choices, and his advice was never given lightly. "Then, at least I'll know why my father couldn't speak of it," Barrett said finally. "At least I'll understand why I've felt like half a man my whole life, successful on paper, but empty where family should be." Miguel nodded slowly. "The ranch will be here when you get back. I know it will. You've been running this place better than I have for years." "That's not what I meant." Miguel's eyes held depths of understanding that came from his own experience with loss. "I meant home will be here. Whatever you find out there, whatever changes for you, you got a place to come back to. You got people who value you for who you are, not who your ancestors were." Barrett felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the thin mountain air. Miguel's loyalty had been the one constant in a life built on solitude and self-reliance. The thought of losing that anchor, of returning as a changed man to a place that might no longer feel like home, terrified him more than any physical danger he might face. "Keep an eye on that bull," Barrett said, deflecting the emotion with practical concerns. "He's been testing the fence line, and I don't trust him not to make a break for Henderson's pasture." "I'll handle Diablo," Miguel assured him. "You handle whatever ghosts you find in Virginia." Barrett closed the trunk and fastened its leather straps. Inside were enough clothes for a week, though he suspected this journey might take longer than planned. He also packed the photograph, despite its fragility, and a small leather journal his father had kept, one of the few personal items Barrett had inherited along with the ranch. The journal contained mainly weather observations and cattle counts, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that had puzzled Barrett for years. Mentions of the Eastern Branch and Ezra's letters, and once, startlingly, the debt that can't be paid. Barrett had always assumed these were business matters, debts or partnerships from his father's younger days. Now he wondered if they might be something else entirely. As evening settled over the ranch, Barrett made his final preparations. He arranged for credit at the bank, gave Miguel authority to make decisions in his absence, and wrote letters to his few business associates explaining his temporary departure. Each task felt weighted with significance, as though he were preparing for a much longer journey than geography suggested. The westbound train would take him to Denver, where he'd catch the eastbound express to Chicago, then on to Washington, and finally Virginia. 5 days of travel to reach a place that existed only in childhood whispers and faded telegraph messages. 5 days to wonder what kind of man Ezra Cole had been, and what kind of inheritance waited in the shadow of mountains Barrett had never seen. That night, Barrett sat once more on his porch, listening to the sounds of his world settling into darkness. Cattle lowed softly in the distance. Somewhere, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild. The wind carried the scent of coming winter, that crisp sharpness that promised snow and long nights by the fire. This was his life, built through decades of work and careful decisions. This was everything he'd ever wanted, everything he'd dreamed of as a young man, starting with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his parents. So why did it feel so empty when measured against a telegram from a dead stranger? Barrett pulled the photograph from his shirt pocket and studied it again in the lamplight. His father's face looked back at him across the years, strong, determined, but marked by shadows that Barrett was only now beginning to understand. Whatever secrets Jacob Cole had carried to his grave, whatever shame or sorrow had driven him west to Montana, the truth of it lay waiting in Virginia. "I'm coming, Ezra," Barrett said quietly to the night wind. "Time to learn what you couldn't tell us while you lived." He went inside and slept fitfully, dreaming of mansions swallowed by vines and voices calling from the depths of family secrets too long buried. The train journey east had given Barrett 5 days to contemplate the wisdom of chasing ghosts, but nothing had prepared him for his first glimpse of the Ezra Cole estate. The hired carriage from Charlottesville climbed winding roads through Virginia hills dressed in autumn gold, past orderly farms and prosperous-looking homesteads, until the driver pulled up before a wrought-iron gate that hung askew on rusted hinges. "This is it?" Barrett asked, though the name Raven's Hollow was still visible on a weathered sign half hidden by honeysuckle vines. "Yes, sir," the driver replied, but his voice carried an odd tension. "You sure you want me to wait? Most folks don't stay long once they get a look at the place." Barrett stepped down from the carriage, his boots crunching on gravel thick with fallen leaves. Beyond the broken gate, a drive wound through towering oaks that had grown wild and untended, their branches forming a canopy so dense that afternoon sunlight barely penetrated to the ground below. The air smelled of decay and abandonment, of moisture and things long dead. "Wait an hour," Barrett said, handing the driver payment. "If I'm not back by then, head back to town. I'll find my own way." The driver pocketed the coins, but made no move to dismount. "Begging your pardon, sir, but you might want to know, folks around here got stories about this place. Say the last family that lived here just up and vanished one night. Left everything behind, food still on the table, beds still made. That was near 30 years ago, and nobody's lived here since." Barrett pushed through the gate, its metal shrieking in protest. "Every old house has stories. Doesn't mean they're true." "Maybe not," the driver called after him. "But you might ask yourself why a place this fine, and it was fine once. You can see that why it's been sitting empty all these years when good land's hard to come by." The drive curved through the overgrown estate, and with each step, Barrett felt the weight of abandonment pressing down on him. What had once been formal gardens were now tangles of wild roses and volunteer trees. Statuary poked through the undergrowth like pale bones, their faces worn smooth by decades of weather. A fountain sat dry and cracked, filled with rotting leaves that released a sweet, sick smell when disturbed. Then the mansion came into view, and Barrett stopped walking altogether. Even in ruin, Raven's Hollow commanded respect. 3 stories of red brick rose from terraced lawns, its federal-style architecture speaking of old money and older traditions. Massive columns supported a portico that had probably welcomed carriages full of Virginia's finest families. But vines had claimed the structure now, wrapping around columns and windows like grasping fingers, and several shutters hung broken from their hinges. Barrett approached slowly, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. No birds sang in the overgrown gardens, no squirrels chattered in the oak trees. Even the wind seemed muffled here, as though the very air had grown thick with secrets. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Barrett pushed it open with his shoulder, hinges groaning like an old man's joints. Sunlight slanted through dirty windows, illuminating a grand foyer that still held echoes of its former elegance. A crystal chandelier hung dark and dusty, its prisms catching what light penetrated the gloom. A staircase swept upward to a landing where oil portraits hung in heavy frames, their subjects' eyes seeming to track Barrett's movement. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny spirits, and Barrett found himself breathing carefully, as though he might disturb something better left sleeping. His footsteps echoed on marble floors as he moved deeper into the house, past rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets that looked more like shrouds in the dim light. The dining room table was set for 12, china and crystal still in place, as though the family had stepped away only moments before. A grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its hands frozen at 11:37. Barrett wondered if that had been morning or evening, and what had happened at that precise moment to stop time in Raven's Hollow forever. He climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step before trusting it with his full weight. The portraits watched him pass stern men in military uniforms, elegant women in silk gowns, children with serious faces that seemed too old for their years. At the landing, one portrait commanded attention above the rest. The nameplate read, Ezra Cole, 1798 to 1875, and Barrett felt his breath catch. The painted face could have been his own father's, the same strong jaw, the same direct gaze, the same burden of unspoken knowledge weighing down the shoulders. But where Barrett's father had carried his secrets like a cross, this man's face held something else. Defiance, perhaps, or guilt so deep it had carved lines around his eyes like scars. Barrett studied the portrait until shadows began gathering in the corners, then continued his exploration. Bedrooms on the second floor contained beds, still made with linens now yellow with age. Personal effects sat on dressing tables, a man's pocket watch, a woman's hair combs, children's toys scattered as though their owners might return at any moment. But it was on the third floor that Barrett found what made his blood run cold. In what must have been the master bedroom, clothes lay scattered on the floor as though removed in haste. A window stood open, its curtains moving in the breeze like ghostly hands. And on the wall, written in what looked like charcoal or burned wood, someone had scrawled a single word: truth. The word seemed to pulse in the failing light, and Barrett backed away from it, suddenly understanding why the locals whispered about curses and disappearances. Whatever had driven the last occupants from Raven's Hollow had been urgent enough to make them abandon everything they owned, urgent enough to leave behind wealth and comfort. For what? As evening approached, Barrett found himself drawn back to the main floor, searching for some explanation, some clue to the mystery that had consumed his thoughts since leaving Montana. He methodically checked every room, every closet, every space that might conceal answers. It was in the kitchen that he found the entrance to the cellar. The wooden door was smaller than the others, almost hidden behind a pantry shelf. Its surface was scarred and stained, as though someone had beaten on it with tools or fists. The iron latch was old but sturdy, and it took Barrett's full strength to lift it. Cool air rose from the darkness below, carrying scents of earth and stone, and something else, something metallic that made Barrett's stomach tighten with unease. Stone steps descended into blackness, worn smooth by generations of use. Barrett lit a candle from the kitchen and descended carefully, the flame casting dancing shadows on stone walls. The cellar was larger than expected, its ceiling supported by thick beams that disappeared into darkness. But it was the far wall that drew his attention and made him understand why Ezra Cole had left him this inheritance. Set into the stone was a door unlike any he'd ever seen. Made of iron plates riveted together, it looked more like a bank vault than a cellar entrance. Rust covered its surface like dried blood, and the massive lock that secured it would have challenged a professional safecracker. Barrett approached slowly, the candle flame wavering in his trembling hand. Above the lock, engraved in the metal, were the words Cole Family Trust and a date, 1859. That was the year his grandfather would have been born, according to family records. But according to everything Barrett had been told, his grandfather had died young, leaving Barrett's father to grow up poor and alone in Montana. Yet here was evidence of a family trust, sealed behind iron and stone, waiting for someone with the Cole name to claim it. Barrett set the candle in a wall sconce and examined the vault door more closely. The lock was complex, but old, its mechanism probably unchanged since it was installed. Fresh scratches around the keyhole suggested someone had tried to force it recently, perhaps Ezra himself in his final years. Standing in that underground chamber, surrounded by the weight of stone and earth and family secrets, Barrett felt the last of his skepticism crumble. The telegram hadn't been a mistake or coincidence. Ezra Cole had left him this inheritance for a reason, and that reason lay locked behind iron and rust in the darkness beneath Raven's Hollow. Whatever his ancestors had done, whatever they had hidden or stolen or buried, the truth of it waited just beyond that vault door. Barrett touched the cold metal with his fingertips and made a silent promise to the shadows that watched from the corners. "I'll find out what you couldn't tell us," he whispered to the darkness. "Whatever it costs, whatever it changes, I'll know the truth." Above him, the old house settled and creaked, as though Raven's Hollow itself was awakening after decades of sleep. Barrett spent his first night in Charlottesville at the Monticello Inn, but sleep came fitfully. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that iron vault door and heard the echo of his own footsteps in the abandoned mansion. By morning, he had made his decision. He would return to Raven's Hollow and find a way into that cellar vault, no matter what it took. The town of Charlottesville buzzed with the gentle energy of a university community, but Barrett paid little attention to the students and professors hurrying past shop windows. He had more pressing concerns. His first stop was Hammond & Sons Locksmith, a narrow shop squeezed between a haberdashery and a bookstore on Main Street. The proprietor was a thin man named Frederick Hammond, whose pale hands bore the permanent stains of metal polish and whose eyes held the keen intelligence of someone who understood the intimate relationship between locks and secrets. "You're asking me to break into a vault," Hammond said after Barrett explained his situation. "That's not exactly standard locksmith work." "I'm not asking you to break in," Barrett corrected. "I'm asking you to open what's mine by legal right. I have the deed to the property." Hammond examined the inheritance documents Barrett had brought, his fingers tracing the legal language with practiced familiarity. "These papers are legitimate, I'll grant you that. But that doesn't mean I can just waltz in and crack open a vault that's been sealed for decades. What would it take?" Hammond leaned back in his chair, studying Barrett with the careful assessment of a man who'd learned to read character in the set of a customer's shoulders and the steadiness of their gaze. "Depends on the lock. You say it's old 1859. That's the date engraved on the door. Civil War era. They built things to last back then, especially if they were protecting something valuable." Hammond rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I'd need to see it first, of course. Assess the mechanism, figure out what tools we're dealing with. Would you be willing to come out to the property?" Hammond's expression shifted, caution creeping into his eyes. "Raven's Hollow? That's the Cole place, isn't it?" Barrett felt his jaw tighten. "You know it?" "Know of it. My father used to tell stories," said old Ezra Cole, "was one of the finest gentlemen in Albemarle County, until—" Hammond stopped himself, seeming to realize he was treading on dangerous ground. "Until what?" "Until his family disappeared. Happened when I was just a boy. but folks still talk about it. One day they were there, next day the house was empty. Never found hide nor hair of them. Barrett set his hat on Hammond's counter and fixed the locksmith with his steadiest gaze. "Mr. Hammond, I've traveled a long way to understand what happened to my family. That vault might contain the only answers I'll ever get. If you help me open it, I'll pay you well. If you won't, I'll find someone who will." Hammond was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the desk. "My grandfather made that lock," he said finally. "Daniel Hammond. He was the finest locksmith in Virginia before the war. If anyone could crack it open, it should be a Hammond. Will you do it?" "I'll take a look. But I want it understood if that lock was sealed for a good reason. If opening it brings trouble down on this town, that's on your head, not mine." Barrett extended his hand. "Understood." They arranged to meet at Raven's Hollow the following morning, but Barrett found himself drawn back to the estate that same afternoon. He rented a horse from the livery stable and rode out through the autumn countryside, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. This time he approached the mansion differently. Instead of focusing on the Gothic decay of the main house, he explored the grounds more thoroughly. Behind the mansion, he discovered the remains of what had once been an extensive working farm stables, a carriage house, servants' quarters, and what looked like the foundations of other buildings long since collapsed or removed. In the carriage house, Barrett found something that made his pulse quicken. Tucked away in a corner, covered by years of dust and debris, sat an old leather satchel. Inside were tools, not farm implements or household items, but the specialized equipment of a locksmith. Calipers, tension wrenches, picks of various sizes, and most intriguingly, what appeared to be handwritten notes describing lock mechanisms and techniques. The papers were yellowed and brittle, but Barrett could make out enough to understand their significance. These weren't just any locksmith's tools. They belonged to someone who had made detailed studies of complex locking mechanisms, someone who understood the intimate workings of vault doors and security systems. One page caught his attention particularly. It was a detailed sketch of a lock mechanism, with notes written in a careful hand. "Family vault, 3-tumbler system key, held by EC secondary mechanism, requires blood verification." The last phrase was circled multiple times, as though the writer had been puzzled or disturbed by it. Barrett sat back on his heels, the papers trembling in his hands. Blood verification. What kind of lock required blood to open? And who was E.C.? The obvious answer was Ezra Cole. But if Ezra had possessed both the key and the knowledge to open the vault, why had it remained sealed? As afternoon shadows lengthened, Barrett made another discovery that deepened the mystery. In what had once been a formal garden, now overgrown with brambles and volunteer trees, he found a series of stone markers partially hidden by undergrowth. At first, he thought they might be decorative elements, but closer examination revealed them to be graves. Simple markers, most bearing only dates from the 1850 seconds and 1860 seconds. But one caught his attention. Thomas Cole, 1842 to 1863, beloved son. The dates would have made Thomas roughly Barrett's father's age, if his father had been born when Barrett thought he had. But according to family stories, Barrett's father Jacob had been an only child. Barrett knelt beside the grave marker, his mind reeling with implications. Had his father lied about being alone in the world? Had there been a brother, a family connection that Jacob had deliberately hidden? The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Barrett looked up to see a woman riding toward him through the trees, her horse picking its way carefully through the overgrown paths. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair pinned back practically, and clothes that suggested both quality and a lack of concern for fashion. Her seat in the saddle was confident, that of someone raised around horses and comfortable in the countryside. "You must be the new owner," she called as she drew closer. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I run the Historical Society here in Charlottesville." Barrett rose, brushing dirt from his knees. Barrett Cole. Though I'm beginning to wonder if I knew what I was inheriting when I came here. Sarah dismounted with easy grace and extended a gloved hand. Nobody ever knows what they're inheriting when they claim a piece of the past. That's what makes it dangerous and fascinating. She had intelligent eyes, the color of autumn leaves, and Barrett found himself wondering how much this woman knew about the Cole family history. "I take it you've heard about this place," he said. "Heard about it? I've been researching it for 3 years. Raven's Hollow is one of the great mysteries of Virginia history. A prominent family, deep roots in the community, substantial wealth, and then they simply vanished, without explanation." Barrett felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of research?" Sarah smiled, and Barrett caught a glimpse of the passion that drove her scholarly pursuits. The kind that leads to more questions than answers, but also the kind that might interest a man who's just discovered he owns the center of one of Virginia's greatest unsolved mysteries. Frederick Hammond arrived at Raven's Hollow the next morning with a cart full of tools and an expression of grim determination. Sarah Mitchell had returned as well, claiming historical interest, but Barrett suspected her motivations ran deeper than academic curiosity. "I've never seen anything like this," Hammond muttered as he examined the vault door by lamplight. The cellar felt even more oppressive with 3 people in it, the walls seeming to press closer with each breath. "My grandfather's work. Certainly I can see his signature technique in the lock pins. But this secondary mechanism..." Hammond ran his fingers along a series of small holes near the lock's base, each about the size of a fingertip. "I've only heard stories about locks like this. They were commissioned by families who dealt in sensitive matters, the kind of people who needed to ensure only blood relatives could access their secrets." "Blood relatives?" Sarah asked, leaning closer to examine the mechanism. Barrett noticed she wore no wedding ring, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with old documents and spent time outdoors. Each authorized family member would have their blood tested when the lock was installed, Hammond explained. "Some chemical process I don't fully understand, but the lock remembers the blood signature. Won't open for anyone else, even with the key." Barrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber. "You're saying this lock was designed so only certain members of the Cole family could open it?" "Exactly. Question is, are you one of them?" Before Barrett could respond, Sarah spoke up. "There's something else you should know about this vault. I found references to it in the county records. It was commissioned in 1859, right before tensions over slavery reached a breaking point in Virginia." She pulled a leather portfolio from her bag and withdrew several yellowed documents. "These are copies of correspondence between Ezra Cole and the bank in Richmond, where he conducted business. Look at this letter from October 1859. Barrett took the paper, squinting in the lamplight to make out the faded handwriting. "The family repository has been completed according to your specifications. All documents relating to our unconventional activities have been secured, should circumstances require. The proof of our righteousness will survive, even if we do not." "Unconventional activities," Barrett repeated. "What kind of activities?" Sarah exchanged a glance with Hammond before answering. "This is where the historical record gets murky. The Cole family was one of the wealthiest in Albemarle County, but their wealth came from sources that weren't entirely traditional." Hammond set down his tools and straightened. "Miss Mitchell, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts based on documentary evidence." Sarah's voice carried the authority of careful research. The Cole family fortune was built, at least in part, on activities that ran counter to the prevailing social order of antebellum Virginia. Barrett felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form, though the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. "You're talking about the Underground Railroad?" "Among other things," Sarah confirmed. "Your family appears to have used their wealth and social position to help enslaved people escape to freedom. They also seem to have provided financial support to abolitionists throughout the South." Hammond whistled low. In 1859, that kind of activity would have been considered treason in Virginia. If the wrong people had found out, they would have been destroyed, Sarah finished. Socially, financially, possibly physically, which explains why the family might have sealed away evidence of their activities. Barrett studied the vault door with new understanding. His ancestors hadn't been hiding shame, they'd been protecting proof of their principles. But that raised another question. If they were heroes, why did my father never speak of them? Why did he act like the family history was something to be ashamed of? Sarah hesitated before answering, and Barrett sensed she knew more than she was saying. Sometimes heroism comes with a price that extends beyond the heroes themselves. Your father may have had reasons for keeping the family history buried. Hammond had returned to examining the lock mechanism, his trained fingers exploring every surface. "I can get past the conventional tumblers," he said finally, "but this blood verification system, that's beyond my skills. We'd need someone from the original family line to activate it." "I'm from the original family line," Barrett pointed out. "Maybe. But blood relationships can be complicated. Just because you carry the Cole name doesn't necessarily mean—" Hammond stopped himself, realizing he was venturing into sensitive territory. Sarah stepped forward. "There might be another way. When I was researching the Cole family, I found references to something called succession documents, papers that would establish the legal and biological line of inheritance for access to the family vault. Where are these documents?" "That's the problem. They were kept in the vault itself. It's a circular security system. You need the documents to prove you have the right to access the vault, but the documents are locked inside the vault." Barrett felt frustration building. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions, and each revelation made his family's history more complex rather than clearer. Hammond packed his tools with careful precision. "I'm going back to town to research my grandfather's notes. He kept detailed records of every lock he built, including the special mechanisms. If there's a way to bypass the blood verification, he would have documented it." "How long will that take?" Barrett asked. "Could be days, could be weeks. These old records aren't well organized, and some of them are, well, they're written in a code my grandfather used for his most sensitive work." After Hammond left, Barrett found himself alone with Sarah in the cellar. The lamplight flickered across her face, highlighting the determination in her eyes. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I didn't want to say in front of Mr. Hammond." Barrett waited, sensing the weight of whatever revelation was coming. "I found evidence that the Cole family vault contains more than just documents about Underground Railroad activities. There are references to substantial financial assets, gold, probably, maybe other valuables." "How substantial?" "Based on the bank records I've seen, possibly enough to represent a significant fortune, even by today's standards." Sarah paused, studying Barrett's reaction. "The question is, what are you planning to do if we get that vault open?" Barrett considered the question carefully. He'd come to Virginia seeking answers about his family's past, but now he was facing the possibility of discovering not just secrets, but substantial wealth. The implications were staggering. "I came here to understand why my father carried so much shame about our family name," he said finally. "If what's in that vault proves our ancestors were heroes rather than villains, then maybe I can finally understand what drove him west and why he never spoke of his past." Sarah nodded slowly. "And the gold?" "I'll face that decision when I have to." Barrett met her gaze steadily. "Right now, I just want the truth." But even as he spoke the words, Barrett wondered if he was prepared for whatever truth that ancient vault might contain. 3 days of waiting for Hammond's research had given Barrett time to explore both Raven's Hollow and his growing connection to Sarah Mitchell. She'd taken to joining him at the estate each morning, bringing coffee in a thermos and sandwiches wrapped in brown paper, transforming their investigation into something that felt almost companionable. On the 4th morning, Barrett made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been searching the mansion's library, a room whose floor-to-ceiling shelves still held hundreds of volumes despite decades of neglect. Most were the expected collections of a wealthy Virginia family: philosophy, history, literature, but tucked behind a set of Shakespeare's complete works, Barrett found a slim volume bound in cracked leather. The book's cover bore no title, only the initials E.C., embossed in gold that had long since tarnished. Inside, written in the same careful hand he'd seen in the locksmith's notes, were what appeared to be journal entries spanning several years in the 1,850 seconds and early 1,860 seconds. Sarah found him sitting in a leather chair by the library's tall windows, the journal open in his lap, his face pale with shock. "Barrett? What is it?" He looked up at her with eyes that seemed to be seeing something far beyond the present moment. "Sarah, my family weren't heroes. They were thieves." She moved closer, settling on the arm of his chair to read over his shoulder. The journal entry that had shaken Barrett was dated March 15th, 1861. "The deed is done, though God forgive me for the blood that was spilled." Thomas argued against it until the end, saying there had to be another way, but I could see no alternative. The Washington family trusted us, called us friends, and we repaid that trust with betrayal most foul. Their land is ours now, legally purchased with money they themselves earned through the sweat of their labor, but purchased under circumstances that make a mockery of law and friendship alike. I have sealed the evidence in the vault, for someday there must be an accounting. Marcus Washington died, believing I would protect his family's future. Instead, I have stolen it. Sarah read the passage twice before speaking. "Barrett, I don't understand. Who was Marcus Washington?" Barrett flipped through more pages, his hands trembling slightly. "According to this, he was a freed slave who'd built up substantial holdings, owned land, operated businesses. He and Ezra Cole were partners of some kind. But then," Barrett found another passage and read aloud, "Marcus came to me for help when the new laws threatened his holdings. Said I was the only white man he trusted to hold his assets safely until the political climate improved. I swore on my children's lives that his property would be returned when danger passed. But the opportunity was too great, the financial pressures too severe. I convinced myself I was protecting what he'd built, but I was only protecting myself." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. So Ezra Cole used his position as a trusted friend to legally take possession of a black man's wealth, then refused to return it. "It gets worse." Barrett's voice was barely above a whisper. "Listen to this entry from 6 months later. Thomas discovered what I had done and threatened to expose me unless I made restitution. My own brother, choosing the honor of our family name over its survival. I could not allow it. The accident at the quarry was easily arranged, a slip of the ropes, a fall that appeared natural. Now only I know the truth of what we stole, and only I bear the burden of silence." The journal fell from Barrett's hands as the full horror of his inheritance became clear. His ancestors hadn't disappeared due to noble principles. They'd vanished because their crimes had finally caught up with them. Sarah picked up the journal and continued reading. "Here, June 1863, the Washington family has grown suspicious. Young Samuel has been asking questions, gathering allies. He knows his father trusted me with more than was ever returned. I fear he has evidence of his own, proof that could destroy not just me but the entire Cole legacy. The vault contains enough documentation to hang us all for theft and murder. If Samuel Washington ever gains access to it, our family name will be destroyed and our wealth forfeit." Barrett stood abruptly, pacing to the window where afternoon light slanted through dirty glass. "My father knew. That's why he never spoke of the family history, why he left Virginia and never looked back. He knew we were living on stolen wealth. Barrett, you can't know that for certain. Your father was just a child when he knew enough." Barrett's voice carried a bitterness that surprised them both. "Look at this, a passage from 865. Have received word that my nephew Jacob has reached Montana Territory safely. I have told him nothing of our true circumstances, only that he must never return to Virginia, never speak of the Cole name with pride. Better he should think us failures than know us for thieves and murderers. The sins of the fathers must not poison the innocence of the children. Sarah closed the journal carefully. So Ezra sent your father away to protect him from the truth, and spent the rest of his life carrying the guilt alone. Barrett turned from the window, his face set with grim determination. That's why the vault was sealed, why the family disappeared. The Washington family must have finally gathered enough evidence to confront them. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the estate's drive. Through the library window, they could see Hammond riding toward the mansion, his saddlebags bulging with what appeared to be documents. "Barrett," Sarah said carefully as they watched the locksmith approach, "what are you going to do with this information?" He was quiet for a moment, watching Hammond dismount and begin unloading his equipment. "The right thing, I hope, though I'm not entirely sure what that is yet." Hammond's voice carried through the mansion's empty halls as he called for them. "Mr. Cole, I've found something that changes everything about that vault." Barrett and Sarah exchanged glances before heading downstairs to meet him. Hammond's face was flushed with excitement and something that might have been apprehension. "I found my grandfather's private notes about the Cole vault," Hammond announced without preamble. "And I found something else, correspondence between my grandfather and someone named Samuel Washington, dated 1863. Barrett felt his blood turn cold. "Samuel Washington? You know the name?" Hammond pulled a yellowed letter from his saddlebag. "According to this, Samuel Washington hired my grandfather to create a secondary access to the Cole family vault. A way to get inside without the family's knowledge or permission." Sarah leaned forward. "Why would he want that?" Hammond's expression grew troubled. "Because, according to these letters, the Washington family believed the Coles had stolen property that rightfully belonged to them. Samuel Washington wanted to recover evidence of the theft, and he wanted to do it in a way that would expose the Coles' crimes publicly." Barrett stared at the letter in Hammond's hands, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The vault didn't just contain evidence of his family's crimes, it contained proof of their victims' attempts to seek justice. "Can you open it?" Barrett asked quietly. "This secondary access your grandfather created?" Hammond nodded slowly. "I believe so. But Mr. Cole, are you certain you want to know what's inside? Because once we open that vault, there's no going back. Whatever truth is locked away in there will become part of your life forever." Barrett looked at Sarah, then at the journal still clutched in her hands. He thought of his father's lifelong burden of shame, of the loneliness that had driven him west to build a new life on the foundation of old lies. "Yes," he said firmly, "it's time for the truth." The secondary access Hammond's grandfather had constructed was ingenious in its simplicity. Hidden behind what appeared to be a natural irregularity in the cellar wall was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, that led directly to the rear of the vault. "Samuel Washington was smaller than most men," Hammond explained as they prepared to breach the vault. "My grandfather designed this access specifically for him. The plan was for Washington to gather evidence of the theft, then present it publicly in a way that would force legal action." Barrett knelt beside the opening, lamplight flickering across his grim features. "Why didn't Washington use this access?" Hammond consulted his grandfather's notes. According to the correspondence, Samuel Washington disappeared in late 1863, just weeks before he was supposed to enter the vault. The letters stop abruptly, with no explanation. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet since discovering the journal, finally spoke. "He didn't disappear. The Cole family killed him, just like they killed Thomas Cole. They must have discovered his plan." Barrett felt the weight of his family's crimes pressing down on him like stones. Each revelation made the burden heavier, the shame deeper. How many people did they destroy to protect their theft? We'll know more once we see what's in the vault, Hammond said practically. But I want it understood. I'm helping you open this as a matter of historical justice. What you do with what we find, that's your decision to make. Barrett nodded and began the awkward crawl through the passage. The space was so narrow he had to remove his jacket and push his lamp ahead of him, the flame casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn stone. Behind him, he could hear Sarah and Hammond waiting in the cellar, their voices muffled by earth and rock. The passage ended at an iron panel that swung open with surprising ease, well-oiled hinges, testament to the quality of Daniel Hammond's craftsmanship. Barrett emerged into the vault itself, a chamber perhaps 10 feet square, with walls lined by wooden shelves and metal filing cabinets. What he found there exceeded his worst fears. The vault was meticulously organized, every document labeled and catalogued with the precision of someone who understood the importance of evidence. Shelves held bound ledgers, documenting financial transactions spanning decades. Filing cabinets contained correspondence, legal documents, and what appeared to be detailed records of property acquisitions. But it was the contents of a leather strongbox on the central table that made Barrett's hands shake as he opened it. Inside were the original property deeds for Marcus Washington's holdings land that, according to the documents, was worth over $50,000 in 1861 currency. The papers showed a clear chain of ownership from Washington to Ezra Cole, but the circumstances of the transfer were damning. What appeared to be a legitimate sale was revealed through accompanying letters to be coercion backed by threats of violence. "Barrett," Sarah's voice called from the passage, "what are you finding?" "Everything," Barrett replied, his voice hollow. They documented everything. As Sarah and Hammond joined him in the vault, Barrett spread the documents across the table. "It's a systematic campaign of terror against the Washington family and anyone who tried to help them." Hammond examined a series of letters with growing alarm. "These are correspondence between Ezra Cole and what appear to be hired men. Look at this one. The Washington property in Lynchburg has been secured. The family offered no resistance after the demonstration at their Richmond holdings." Sarah picked up another document, her face pale in the lamplight. "This is a list of black-owned businesses in Virginia, with notes about their acquisition potential and methods for forcing sales. The Cole family wasn't just stealing from Marcus Washington. They were systematically targeting successful black entrepreneurs throughout the region." Barrett found himself staring at a map mounted on the vault's far wall. It showed Virginia and parts of North Carolina with properties marked in different colors. Red markers indicated acquired properties, while black markers were labeled resistance eliminated. "Dear God," he whispered. They were running an organized campaign of theft and murder, using their social position and connections to steal from people who had no legal recourse. Hammond discovered another strongbox, this one containing physical evidence that made the scope of the crimes undeniable. Gold coins, jewelry, personal effects that had clearly been taken from victims' homes. Each item was labeled with a name and date, turning the vault into a macabre museum of theft and violence. But it was Sarah who made the discovery that changed everything Barrett thought he knew about his situation. "Barrett," she said quietly, holding up a document that trembled in her hands. "You need to see this." She handed him a will, dated 1864, and bearing the seal of a Virginia court. As Barrett read it, his world shifted again. "This is Marcus Washington's will," Sarah explained. "His original will, the one that was supposed to be executed after his death. According to this document, Marcus Washington left his entire estate, including the properties stolen by the Cole family, to his descendants." Barrett's mouth went dry. "His descendants, more specifically," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "to his daughter Rebecca Washington and her children. Rebecca Washington, who married—" She paused, checking another document. who married a man named Samuel Mitchell in 1855. The vault fell silent except for the sound of their breathing. Barrett looked at Sarah with new understanding, pieces of a larger puzzle finally clicking into place. "Mitchell," he said slowly. "Your family name?" Sarah nodded, tears gleaming in her eyes. "I'm Marcus Washington's great-great-granddaughter. Everything your family stole, it belongs to my family. It belongs to me." Hammond set down the documents he'd been examining and stepped back, clearly recognizing he'd stumbled into something far more personal and complex than a simple historical investigation. Barrett stared at Sarah, his mind reeling with implications. "You knew. When you approached me at the estate, when you offered to help with the research, you knew who I was." "I suspected," Sarah admitted. "My family has been researching the Cole theft for generations. When word spread that someone named Cole had inherited Raven's Hollow, my grandfather sent me to investigate." "Your grandfather?" "Samuel Washington Mitchell. He's 93 years old, and he's spent his entire life trying to recover what was stolen from our family." Sarah's voice carried decades of pain and determination. He never forgot the stories his grandmother told him about Marcus Washington's wealth, about the white family that befriended him only to destroy him. Barrett felt as though the ground beneath his feet had given way. Everything he'd discovered in the past week, his family's crimes, the evidence in the vault, even Sarah's presence in his life, had been orchestrated by people seeking justice for wrongs committed over a century ago. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Now you have a choice to make. You can keep the stolen wealth, knowing what it cost to obtain. Or you can do what your ancestors should have done generations ago, return what was taken and accept the consequences." Barrett looked around the vault, taking in the evidence of his family's crimes and the proof of another family's suffering. In his hands, he held the power to right a historical wrong, but doing so would cost him everything he'd inherited from his father's sacrifice. The weight of that choice settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, and Barrett realized that some burdens were passed down through generations until someone finally chose to carry them properly. The revelation that Sarah was Marcus Washington's descendant hung in the vault's stale air like a physical presence, but Barrett sensed there were still depths to this story he hadn't fathomed. Sarah's confession felt more like the opening of a door than its closing. "There's something else, isn't there?" Barrett asked, studying her face in the lamplight. "You didn't just happen to be researching this place when I arrived." Sarah exchanged a glance with Hammond, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the personal nature of their discovery became clear. "Perhaps I should leave you two to discuss this privately," Hammond suggested, but Barrett shook his head. "No. You've come this far with us, and your family was involved in this from the beginning. You have a right to hear the rest." Barrett turned back to Sarah. "Tell me everything." Sarah sat down heavily on a wooden crate, suddenly looking older than her 30 years. "My family never stopped fighting for what was taken from us. Every generation has carried the responsibility of seeking justice for Marcus Washington's murder and recovering our stolen inheritance." She pulled a leather portfolio from her bag and withdrew a set of documents Barrett hadn't seen before. "These are modern legal papers," she continued. "For the past 20 years, my family has been quietly purchasing properties throughout Virginia. Properties that were originally stolen from Marcus Washington and sold off by the Cole family over the decades." Barrett examined the documents with growing amazement. Deeds, purchase agreements, and legal filings showed a systematic campaign of land acquisition spanning 2 decades. "You've been buying back your own inheritance?" "Piece by piece, yes. My grandfather saved every penny for 60 years to start the process. My father continued it, and now it's my responsibility." Sarah's voice carried the weight of generational purpose. "We've recovered about 40% of what was originally stolen." Hammond whistled low. "That must have cost a fortune." "Everything we had," Sarah confirmed. My family has lived modestly for generations, pouring every available resource into this quest for justice. We've bought land, businesses, even residential properties that were built on sites that once belonged to Marcus Washington. Barrett felt his understanding of the situation shift again. When you learned I'd inherited this place. We saw an opportunity to recover the centerpiece of our stolen heritage, Sarah finished, but also to finally get the documentary evidence we needed to prove our legal claim to the entire estate. Barrett studied the documents more carefully. The scope of Sarah's family's efforts was staggering. They'd spent decades researching property records, tracking down descendants of people who'd unknowingly purchased stolen land, and methodically rebuilding their ancestors' empire through legitimate means. But there's more, isn't there? Barrett pressed. This feels too coordinated, too convenient. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. The inheritance you received wasn't random, Barrett. My grandfather engineered it. The words hit Barrett like a physical blow. What do you mean? Ezra Cole died intestate without a will. Under Virginia law, the property should have gone to the state after a certain period with no claimants. But my grandfather discovered that Ezra had a living relative in Montana. He hired attorneys to ensure you would be notified of your inheritance. Barrett felt the last of his assumptions crumble. Your grandfather wanted me to inherit this place? He wanted to see what kind of man you were, Sarah explained. Whether you'd come here seeking easy wealth or genuine understanding, whether you'd be the kind of person who would do the right thing when confronted with the truth about your family's crimes. Hammond set down the lamp and leaned against the vault wall. This has been a test from the beginning. Not a test, Sarah corrected. An opportunity for both our families to finally heal wounds that have festered for over a century. Barrett paced the small confines of the vault, his mind racing through the implications. So, everything meeting you at the estate, your offer to help with research, even finding these documents, all of it was planned? The research was real. My feelings... Sarah paused, color rising in her cheeks. My feelings for you are real, Barrett. That wasn't part of any plan. The admission hung between them, complicated by the web of history and deception that had brought them together. Barrett examined another set of documents from Sarah's portfolio, these bearing more recent dates. What are these? Partnership agreements, Sarah said quietly. Legal frameworks my grandfather had drawn up for different scenarios, depending on how you responded to learning the truth. Barrett read through the papers with growing amazement. The documents outlined various ways the two families could work together to manage the recovered properties, share the costs and benefits of restoration, and create a foundation to help other families recover assets lost to historical theft. Your grandfather thought of everything. He's had 93 years to plan, Sarah reminded him. And he learned from our family's mistakes. When Samuel Washington tried to recover our property through confrontation and legal challenges, he was murdered for it. My grandfather decided that cooperation and gradual restoration would be more effective than open warfare. Barrett found himself staring at a document that made his breath catch. Sarah, this partnership agreement, it's not just about property recovery, is it? She met his gaze steadily. My grandfather also hoped that bringing our families together might heal the personal wounds, not just the financial ones. He believed that descendants of both families have been harmed by the legacy of theft and violence. He was right, Barrett said quietly. My father carried shame his entire life for crimes he didn't commit. I've spent 53 years feeling like something was missing from my life, never understanding why. Hammond cleared his throat. If I may ask, what happens now? Do you accept the partnership? Barrett looked around the vault one more time, taking in the evidence of his ancestors' crimes and the proof of Sarah's family's determination. I need to see your grandfather. Sarah's eyes widened. Barrett, if he's the one who orchestrated this entire situation, if he's the one who decided to trust me with the truth, then I owe him the courtesy of a face-to-face conversation. Before I make any decisions about property or partnerships, I need to understand what kind of man has been pulling the strings of my life." Sarah nodded slowly. "He's at the family home in Richmond. I can arrange a meeting." "Tomorrow," Barrett said firmly. "I want this settled before I lose my nerve or start second-guessing what I know is right." As they prepared to leave the vault, Barrett noticed Hammond packing up his tools with unusual care. "Mr. Hammond," Barrett said, "I hope you understand that everything we've discussed here needs to remain confidential until you decide how to handle the situation," Hammond finished. "I understand, Mr. Cole. My family has kept secrets for the powerful before. We know how to keep quiet." But as they climbed back through the passage and emerged into the cellar proper, Barrett caught Hammond studying him with an expression that suggested the locksmith was wrestling with thoughts of his own. "Is there something else, Mr. Hammond?" Hammond hesitated before answering. "It's just my grandfather's notes contained one more item I haven't mentioned. A letter he received from Samuel Washington just before Washington disappeared." Sarah stopped climbing the cellar stairs. "What kind of letter?" "Instructions for what to do if something happened to him. Specific directions about how to ensure the truth about the Cole family crimes would eventually come to light." Hammond looked between Barrett and Sarah. "I think Samuel Washington knew he was going to be killed, and he made sure the evidence would survive, even if he didn't." Barrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber. "You're saying he planned for this moment? For someone like me to eventually learn the truth?" "I'm saying your great-great-uncle Samuel Washington was apparently a very smart man who understood that justice sometimes takes more than one generation to achieve." As they emerged into the fading daylight, Barrett realized he was no longer just dealing with the crimes of his ancestors or the claims of Sarah's family. He was the culmination of a plan that had been unfolding for over a century, carefully orchestrated by people who'd refused to let injustice remain buried. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders as they walked back toward the mansion. Tomorrow, he would meet the architect of this elaborate restoration of justice. Tonight, he would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be when that meeting took place. The Mitchell family home in Richmond was not what Barrett had expected. Instead of the grand mansion he'd imagined, he found himself standing before a modest two-story house in a well-maintained but unremarkable neighborhood. The building spoke of careful stewardship rather than wealth, of people who valued substance over display. Sarah had driven him from Charlottesville in her automobile, the journey providing nearly 2 hours for conversation that had been both illuminating and increasingly tense. The closer they got to Richmond, the more Barrett sensed Sarah's nervousness about the approaching meeting. "He's not what you're expecting," she warned as they walked up the front path. "Grandfather Samuel has spent his entire life fighting for justice, but it's changed him, made him intense." Barrett adjusted his collar, suddenly feeling underdressed for what might be the most important conversation of his life. "Intense how? You'll understand when you meet him." The front door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman in her 60s with Sarah's auburn hair now streaked with silver. Her resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable, but where Sarah carried herself with scholarly confidence, this woman radiated the quiet strength of someone who'd spent decades supporting a cause larger than herself. "Mother," Sarah said, embracing the older woman, "this is Barrett Cole." Barrett found himself the subject of intense scrutiny as Sarah's mother examined him with eyes that seemed to weigh not just his character, but his entire family history. "Rebecca Mitchell," she said finally, extending her hand. "I'm named after my great-grandmother, Marcus Washington's daughter." The introduction carried weight beyond its simple words. Barrett understood he was meeting someone who carried the living memory of his family's crimes, someone who'd grown up hearing first-hand accounts of theft and murder passed down through generations. "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't know what to say about what my family did to yours." Rebecca studied him for a moment longer before stepping aside to let them enter. You can start by listening to what my father has to say. He's been waiting 93 years for this conversation. The interior of the house was spare but elegant, furnished with pieces that spoke of quality and care rather than ostentation. Family photographs lined the walls, generations of Washingtons and Mitchells who'd carried the burden of seeking justice for crimes committed in another century. Rebecca led them to a sitting room where afternoon light streamed through tall windows. In a leather chair beside the fireplace sat the man Barrett had come to meet. Samuel Washington Mitchell was 93 years old, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone decades younger. His body was frail, bent by age and the weight of years, but his gaze was steady as he studied Barrett with undisguised curiosity. "So," the old man said, his voice surprisingly strong, "you're Jacob Cole's boy." Barrett nodded, unsure how to respond to someone who spoke of his father as though he'd known him personally. "Sit down, son. We have much to discuss." Barrett took the chair opposite Samuel Mitchell, acutely aware that he was facing the architect of everything that had brought him to Virginia. Sarah and her mother settled on a nearby sofa, silent witnesses to a conversation that had been decades in the making. "I knew your father," Samuel began without preamble. "Met him twice, actually, once when he was 12 years old and again when he was 17. Barrett felt his breath catch. "That's impossible. My father never returned to Virginia after Ezra sent him west." Samuel's smile held no warmth. "Your father didn't return. I went to find him." The old man reached for a leather portfolio that lay on the table beside his chair. From it, he withdrew a photograph. Barrett had never seen a daguerreotype showing two young men standing beside a Montana homestead. One was unmistakably Barrett's father. The other was a young black man whose bearing and features marked him as Samuel Mitchell. "I was 23 when I made that journey to Montana," Samuel continued. "Spent 3 years tracking down Jacob Cole, learning about his life, understanding the kind of man Ezra had sent away to protect." Barrett stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. "Why? What did you want with my father?" "Justice," Samuel said simply. "My great-grandfather Marcus Washington had been murdered by the Cole family. My family had spent decades gathering evidence, building a case that would hold up in court. But we needed something more. We needed a Cole family member, willing to acknowledge the truth and make restitution." Sarah leaned forward. "Grandfather, you never told me you'd met Barrett's father." "Some stories are too painful to share until the time is right," Samuel replied, his eyes never leaving Barrett's face. "Your father was a good man, Barrett, kind, hard-working, honest to his bones. When I told him what his family had done, when I showed him the evidence, he was horrified." Barrett felt tears burning behind his eyes. "What did he say?" "He wept," Samuel said quietly. "Sat right there on his porch and wept like a child. Said he'd always known something was wrong, that Ezra's letters had carried a weight of shame he'd never understood." Samuel pulled another document from his portfolio. "Your father wanted to make things right immediately, was ready to sign over everything he owned, wanted to come back to Virginia and face whatever consequences awaited him. But he didn't," Barrett said, "because I stopped him." Samuel's voice carried the weight of a decision that had haunted him for decades. Jacob Cole was 17 years old. Barrett. He'd built a life through honest work. Had nothing to do with his family's crimes except the accident of his birth. I couldn't destroy an innocent boy to satisfy my thirst for justice. Barrett studied the photograph, seeing his father's face from an age he'd never imagined, young, earnest, unmarked by the burden of shame that would follow him the rest of his life. "So what did you do?" "I made him a promise," Samuel said, "that I would wait, that I would give him time to build his life, raise a family if God blessed him with one, become the man he was meant to be, without the shadow of his ancestors' crimes hanging over him." Samuel's eyes fixed on Barrett with laser intensity. "And I promised that when the time was right, when he had a son old enough to understand and strong enough to make his own choices about justice and responsibility, I would contact that son and give him the opportunity his father never had. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Barrett felt the full weight of the plan that had been unfolding around him his entire life, the careful patience of a man who'd waited nearly 3/4 of a century to claim justice for his murdered ancestor. "The telegram," Barrett said finally. "The inheritance notice. You arranged all of it. I kept watch over your family for 70 years, Samuel confirmed. Knew when you were born, followed your success in Montana, waited for you to become the kind of man who could handle this responsibility. When Ezra Cole died and left the estate legally unencumbered, I saw the opportunity to bring you back to Virginia and give you the same choice I once offered your father." Sarah reached for Barrett's hand, her touch warm and steadying. "Grandfather wanted you to have the chance to be the man your father couldn't be, someone who could make restitution while still having a life to live afterward." Barrett looked around the modest room, taking in the family photographs and simple furniture, understanding finally the true cost of Samuel Mitchell's patient pursuit of justice. "You've spent your entire family's resources on this," Barrett said. "Buying back the stolen properties, hiring lawyers, maintaining the research. You've impoverished yourselves to recover what was taken." Samuel's smile was genuine for the first time since Barrett had entered the room. "Money was never the point, son. Justice was the point. Healing was the point. My great-grandfather, Marcus Washington, didn't die for gold or land. He died because he trusted the wrong man. I couldn't bring him back, but I could make sure his trust hadn't been completely misplaced." Rebecca Mitchell rose from the sofa and walked to a writing desk in the corner. She returned with a leather-bound book that she placed in Barrett's hands. "This is Marcus Washington's Bible," she said, "the last thing of his that survived Ezra Cole's theft. Look at the family tree he wrote in the front cover." Barrett opened the ancient book carefully, its pages yellow and brittle with age. On the inside cover, written in fading ink, was a detailed family tree tracing Marcus Washington's lineage back 3 generations. But it was the entries at the bottom that made Barrett's heart stop. There, in Marcus Washington's own handwriting, were the names of his children and grandchildren, including a daughter named Rebecca Washington, who had married Samuel Mitchell, and beside Rebecca's name, added in different ink, were the names of her descendants down to the present day. Barrett's finger traced the family tree until he found Sarah's name, then looked up at her with new understanding. "This proves your legal claim to everything." "It proves more than that," Samuel said quietly. "Look at the other branch of the tree." Barrett studied the document more carefully and found what Samuel was referring to. Listed among Marcus Washington's grandchildren was a notation that made his blood run cold. "Thomas Washington Mitchell, son of Rebecca and Samuel, married Mary Cole, 1878. "Mary Cole," Barrett said slowly. "Ezra Cole's niece," Sarah confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus Washington's great-grandson married into the Cole family a generation after the theft." Barrett stared at the family tree, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "That means we're cousins," Sarah said. "Distant cousins, but family nonetheless. The blood that was spilled by theft and murder eventually found its way back together through love." Samuel Mitchell leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. "That's why I waited, Barrett. That's why I spent 93 years planning this moment. Because sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about healing. Sometimes the only way to repair what was broken is to bring the broken pieces back together." Barrett closed the Bible carefully, his hands trembling. He was holding not just proof of Sarah's claim to his inheritance, but evidence that their families had been intertwined by both crime and redemption across more than a century. "What happens now?" he asked. Samuel Mitchell smiled, and for the first time Barrett saw not the architect of elaborate justice, but simply an old man who'd carried a burden too heavy for one lifetime. "Now, Barrett Cole," Samuel said, You get to choose what kind of ending this story has. Barrett sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of Samuel Mitchell's revelation settling over him like lead. The family Bible remained open in his lap, its faded pages containing the proof that everything he'd believed about his heritage was incomplete at best, false at worst. "I need to understand something," Barrett said finally, looking up at Samuel. "When you met my father, when you showed him the evidence of what Ezra had done, what exactly did you ask of him?" Samuel's eyes grew distant, as though he was seeing across the decades to that long-ago conversation on a Montana porch. "I asked him to come back to Virginia with me, to publicly acknowledge his family's crimes and deed over whatever property remained in Cole hands. I had documentation showing that your father was Ezra's legal heir, that he had the authority to make restitution, and when he agreed, I realized I was asking him to destroy his life for the sake of my family's pain." Samuel's voice carried decades of regret. Jacob Cole was 17 years old. Barrett. He'd built a ranch through honest work, had dreams of his own. What right did I have to demand he sacrifice everything for crimes he didn't commit? Barrett closed the Bible and set it carefully on the table between them. "So you let him live with the burden of knowing instead." "I gave him the choice," Samuel corrected. "I told him I would wait until he had a son grown to manhood, someone who could make an informed decision about justice and family responsibility." "Your father agreed to that bargain." Sarah leaned forward. "Grandfather, why didn't you tell me any of this when we were planning Barrett's visit to Virginia?" Samuel's weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair. "Because I needed to see what kind of man Barrett Cole had become before I revealed the full scope of what I was asking. Some men seek easy wealth, others seek only to escape the past. I needed to know which kind of man you were." Barrett felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The inheritance, the vault, even Sarah's research, it was all designed to test my character. "Not test," Samuel said firmly. "Reveal. I wanted to give you the opportunity to discover the truth yourself, to understand the weight of what your family had done and what mine had suffered. Then, when you came to me, you'd be coming with full knowledge and the freedom to make an authentic choice." Rebecca Mitchell rose from her chair and walked to the window, her silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun. "Papa, are you certain Barrett needs to know about the other thing?" Barrett's attention sharpened. "What other thing?" Samuel and Rebecca exchanged a look that spoke of family secrets Barrett couldn't interpret. Sarah seemed equally puzzled, her gaze moving between her mother and grandfather with growing concern. "Mother?" Sarah prompted. "What are you talking about?" Samuel sighed deeply, suddenly looking every one of his 93 years. "There's one more document, Barrett. One piece of evidence that changes everything about what I'm asking you to do." From his leather portfolio, Samuel withdrew a single sheet of paper, its edges worn soft with age. He handed it to Barrett with hands that trembled slightly. Barrett read the document twice before its significance penetrated his consciousness. It was a letter, written in his father's careful hand and dated just 3 years earlier. "Dear Mr. Mitchell," the letter began, "I have lived with the knowledge you shared with me for 36 years. The burden of my family's crimes has haunted every success I've achieved, every acre I've acquired, every moment of happiness I've experienced. I write now to tell you that I am dying of a cancer the doctors cannot cure, and I want to ensure my son understands the choice that will one day be his to make." Barrett's vision blurred as he continued reading. His father had detailed everything: the meeting with Samuel, the evidence of the Cole family's crimes, his own guilt at benefiting from stolen wealth. "I have enclosed documentation transferring legal ownership of my Montana ranch to your family," the letter continued. "It is built on money that ultimately derives from what was stolen from Marcus Washington. I cannot undo my ancestors' crimes, but I can ensure the wealth they generated returns to its rightful owners. I ask only that you wait until after my death to contact my son, so that his final memories of me are not poisoned by shame. The letter was signed Jacob Cole and dated just 6 months before Barrett's father had died. Barrett's hands shook as he set the letter down. He gave you the ranch? Legally? Yes, Samuel confirmed. Your father deeded the entire Montana property to my family 3 years ago. By rights, Barrett, you own nothing. Everything you thought was yours belongs to us. The room spun around Barrett as the implications hit him. His life's work, his father's legacy, the empire he'd built through decades of labor, none of it had ever truly been his. Why didn't you claim it? Barrett asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why let me continue running the ranch, thinking it was mine? Samuel's eyes filled with tears. Because your father asked me to give you the choice he never had. The choice to keep what you'd built through your own work, or to voluntarily return what was stolen and forge a new path based on justice rather than inherited guilt. Barrett looked at Sarah, seeing his own shock reflected in her face. You didn't know about this either? She shook her head. Grandfather never told me about Papa Jacob's letter. I thought we were just trying to recover the Virginia properties. Samuel struggled to his feet, his frail body moving with determination. From a desk drawer, he withdrew another set of papers, formal legal documents bearing recent dates. These are the deeds to your Montana ranch, Barrett, signed over to my family by your father, properly notarized and legally binding, but they've never been filed with the authorities. They remain in my possession, waiting. Barrett stared at the documents that could destroy everything he'd worked for. Waiting for what? For you to decide what kind of man you choose to be, Samuel said quietly. Will you be like Ezra Cole, clinging to wealth built on others' suffering? Or will you be the man your father tried to be, someone willing to sacrifice personal comfort for the sake of justice? Barrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Everything he'd believed about his life, his inheritance, his very identity, was crumbling around him. I need time to think, he managed. Of course, Samuel said. This is not a decision to be made lightly. Barrett moved toward the door, then stopped. Mr. Mitchell, if I choose to honor my father's wishes and transfer ownership of the ranch, what happens to the people who work for me? What happens to Miguel and the others whose livelihoods depend on the ranch? Samuel's smile was sad but approving. That, Barrett, is exactly the kind of question your father would have asked, and exactly why I believe you're the right man to make this choice. Barrett walked the streets of Richmond until darkness fell, his mind churning through the impossible choice Samuel Mitchell had presented him. The city's gas lamps cast pools of warm light on cobblestone streets as he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. When he finally returned to the boarding house where he'd taken a room, he found Sarah waiting in the parlor, her face etched with concern. I was worried, she said simply. You've been gone for hours. Barrett sank into the chair beside her, exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. How long have you known about the marriage certificate? Sarah looked puzzled. What marriage certificate? Barrett studied her face carefully, searching for any sign of deception. Your family Bible showed that Marcus Washington's descendants married into the Cole family. That makes us cousins. Barrett, I saw that family tree for the first time today, same as you. I had no idea our families were connected by marriage. Sarah's voice carried conviction that Barrett found himself believing. My grandfather keeps his secrets carefully. He only reveals what he thinks people need to know when they need to know it. Barrett rubbed his temples, trying to ease the tension that had been building all day. So neither of us knew we were related when we started to have feelings for each other. Does it change anything? Sarah asked quietly. The connection is distant enough to be legal, if that's what concerns you. Barrett looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, the way she'd stood by him through every revelation about his family's crimes. What changes everything is that I don't know who I am anymore, Barrett said. This morning I was Barrett Cole, successful rancher, owner of 12,000 acres of Montana land. Tonight I'm what? The descendant of murderers and thieves who's been living on charity from the very family my ancestors destroyed. Sarah moved to the chair beside his, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough to see the concern in her eyes. You're the same man you were this morning, she said firmly. Learning about your family's past doesn't change who you've become through your own choices. Doesn't it? Barrett's voice carried a bitterness that surprised them both. Everything I've accomplished, everything I thought I'd built, it's all founded on stolen wealth. The money my father used to start the ranch, the land he purchased, the cattle he bought, all of it traces back to what Ezra Cole stole from your family. Sarah was quiet for a moment before responding. Barrett, can I tell you something about my grandfather, something I've never told anyone? Barrett nodded. When I was 16, I found a letter he'd written but never sent. It was addressed to someone named Jacob Cole, and it said he was dropping his pursuit of restitution. Said he'd realized that revenge was poisoning his life, and that he wanted to break the cycle of pain that had haunted both our families. Barrett felt his breath catch. What changed his mind? My grandmother died that year, cancer, and in her final days, she told him that Marcus Washington wouldn't have wanted his descendants to spend their lives consumed by anger and loss. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She said Marcus would have wanted his family to build something new, something better, rather than spend generations trying to tear down what had been built on his bones. But he continued the pursuit anyway, because my father convinced him to. My father believed justice delayed was justice denied, that letting the Cole family keep what they'd stolen would dishonor Marcus Washington's memory. Sarah's voice grew heavy with old family pain. They fought about it for years, whether seeking restitution was about justice or revenge. Barrett studied Sarah's face in the lamplight. What do you believe? I believe, Sarah said carefully, that both families have been prisoners of this history for too long. Your father carried guilt for crimes he didn't commit. My family has spent 4 generations pursuing wealth that might not be worth the cost of recovering it. From her bag, Sarah withdrew a document Barrett hadn't seen before. After you left today, I had a long conversation with my grandfather about what he really wants from all this. Barrett examined the document. It appeared to be some kind of legal agreement, but written in language more complex than he could quickly decipher. What is this? It's a proposal my grandfather drafted years ago but never showed anyone. A way for both families to benefit from the truth without destroying either one. Barrett read through the document more carefully. As its contents became clear, his amazement grew. This proposes a joint venture, shared ownership of all the recovered properties, including the Montana ranch. More than that, Sarah said. It establishes a foundation using the combined assets to help other families recover property lost to historical theft. It turns our specific situation into something that could help hundreds of people. Barrett set the document down, his mind reeling. Your grandfather planned this too? I think my grandfather has been planning for every possible outcome since he was 23 years old. Sarah's smile was rueful. But this particular plan, it requires both families to participate willingly. It can't be imposed through legal action or moral pressure. Barrett looked at Sarah, seeing not just the descendant of people his family had wronged, but a woman who had somehow maintained compassion and hope despite carrying the burden of generations of pain. What happens if I say yes to this? What happens to Miguel and the other people who depend on the ranch? They become employees of the foundation, Sarah said, with better benefits and more security than they have now. Miguel would essentially become a partner in managing the Montana operations. Barrett felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. And what happens between us? If we're business partners and distant cousins and... Sarah reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady. That depends on what kind of future you want to build, Barrett Cole. One based on the sins of the past, or one based on the possibilities we create together. Barrett looked down at their joined hands, seeing in them the symbolic end of a century-old cycle of pain and the beginning of something entirely new. "I want to meet with your grandfather tomorrow," Barrett said. "I want to discuss the terms of this partnership." Sarah's smile was radiant. "Does that mean?" "It means I'm ready to stop being Jacob Cole's guilty son and start being Barrett Cole, partner, foundation co-founder, and the man who finally brought justice to Marcus Washington's family." 6 months later, Barrett stood on the porch of the restored Ravens Hollow mansion, watching Sarah direct a team of workers as they installed the final piece of signage for the Marcus Washington Foundation. The building that had once housed the evidence of his family's crimes now served as headquarters for an organization dedicated to helping families recover assets lost to historical theft and discrimination. The transformation had been remarkable. What had been a crumbling monument to abandonment and shame was now a thriving center of activity. The mansion's rooms housed research staff, legal advocates, and administrative personnel working on cases from across the South. The grounds, once overgrown and forbidding, had been restored to their original elegance, while remaining open to the public as a memorial garden honoring Marcus Washington and others who had suffered similar injustices. Barrett carried a leather portfolio as he walked down to join Sarah, its contents representing the culmination of everything they'd worked toward since that day in Samuel Mitchell's parlor. "The last signature," he announced, holding up the partnership agreement that would formally transfer all remaining Cole family assets to the foundation while establishing Barrett as its co-director alongside Sarah. Sarah looked up from her conversation with the sign installers, her face bright with accomplishment. "Mr. Hammond finished the vault restoration?" "Yesterday. The Cole family vault is now a proper archive, climate-controlled and secure. All the original documents are preserved for researchers and legal proceedings." Barrett smiled. "Frederick says his grandfather would have been proud to see his work finally used for justice instead of concealment." The partnership agreement they'd ultimately negotiated was more complex and far-reaching than Barrett had initially imagined. Beyond simply transferring the stolen wealth back to its rightful owners, it had established mechanisms for identifying and assisting other families whose property had been taken through similar means. The Foundation's legal team had already recovered over $200,000 in assets for families across Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Miguel Santos emerged from the mansion, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. The ranch foreman had adapted to his new role as director of the Foundation's Montana operations with the same steady competence he'd brought to managing cattle. More importantly, he'd become the bridge between Barrett's old life and his new purpose. "The Richmond families want to know if you're still planning to attend the ceremony next week," Miguel said, joining Barrett and Sarah on the mansion's front steps. Barrett nodded. The ceremony Miguel referenced was perhaps the most important event in the Foundation's brief history, the formal return of the last piece of property stolen by Ezra Cole. A tract of land in Richmond that had been purchased by Marcus Washington in 1860 and seized by the Cole family after his murder was being returned to his descendants in a public ceremony attended by the governor. "Sarah, have you heard from your grandfather about whether he's well enough to attend?" Sarah's expression grew tender at the mention of Samuel Mitchell. At 93, the architect of their long journey toward justice was failing, but he'd lived to see the completion of the work he'd begun as a young man. "He insists he'll be there," Sarah replied. "Says he's waited 70 years to see Marcus Washington's name officially cleared, and he's not missing it now." Barrett looked out over the restored grounds of Ravens Hollow, remembering his first glimpse of this place 6 months earlier. Then, it had seemed like a monument to family shame and buried secrets. Now it represented something else entirely, proof that truth, however long delayed, could ultimately prevail. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel drew their attention to the mansion's drive. Barrett recognized the approaching vehicle as belonging to Dr. Williams, the physician who'd been monitoring Samuel Mitchell's health. Sarah hurried down the drive to meet the carriage, her face tight with concern. Barrett followed, Miguel close behind. Dr. Williams climbed down from his carriage with the careful movements of a man bearing difficult news. "Miss Mitchell, Mr. Cole, I'm afraid I have something to tell you about your grandfather." Sarah's hand found Barrett's, her fingers gripping tightly. "Is he?" "He's alive," Dr. Williams said quickly, "but very weak. I don't think he has much time left. He's asking for both of you." The ride to Richmond passed in tense silence, Sarah's worry evident in every line of her posture. Barrett found himself thinking about the extraordinary man who'd shaped both their lives, a person with the patience to spend decades planning justice and the wisdom to understand that healing required more than simple restitution. They found Samuel Mitchell in his bed, surrounded by family but alert and determined. His eyes lit up when he saw Barrett and Sarah enter the room. "There you are," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I wanted to give you something before I join my ancestors." From beneath his pillow, Samuel withdrew a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a gold ring bearing an intricate engraving. "This was Marcus Washington's wedding ring," Samuel explained. "The only thing of his that Ezra Cole couldn't steal because my great-grandmother had it when he was murdered." Samuel placed the ring in Barrett's palm, his weathered fingers trembling with effort. "I want you to have it, not as a Cole, but as a member of Marcus Washington's family, because that's what you've become through your choices, family." Barrett felt tears burning his eyes as he examined the ring. The engraving was worn but still legible. "M.W. to R.W. 1840, love conquers all." "I can't accept this," Barrett began, but Samuel waved away his protests. "You've given my family justice, Barrett. You've given Marcus Washington's memory the honor it deserved. More than that, you've given me the chance to see that love really can conquer the hate that poisoned so many lives." Samuel's eyes moved to Sarah, his expression softening. "And you, granddaughter, you've found a way to love someone despite the history between your families. That's the greatest victory of all." 3 days later, Samuel Washington Mitchell died peacefully in his sleep. He was buried beside his wife in the Richmond Cemetery, where Marcus Washington's grave had finally been marked with a proper headstone, paid for by the foundation that bore his name. At the funeral, Barrett stood with Sarah and her family, no longer an outsider seeking to understand his heritage, but a member of a family built on justice rather than blood, on choices rather than accidents of birth. As they left the cemetery, Sarah slipped her hand into Barrett's, the gold ring he now wore, catching the afternoon sunlight. "What happens now?" she asked. Barrett looked back at the graves of people who'd waited over a century for justice, then ahead to the life he and Sarah were building together. "Now," he said, "we get back to work. There are a lot more families out there who need what we've learned about healing old wounds." They walked toward their carriage, hand in hand, carrying forward the legacy of people who'd understood that sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to let injustice have the final word.